In 1943, the fighting around Finschhafen unfolded inside a wider Allied strategy aimed at breaking Japan's defensive system in the Bismarcks and reducing the operational reach of the 18th Army in New Guinea. Under Operation Cartwheel, General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area advanced by securing airfields, ports, and staging areas that could support successive amphibious moves while placing major Japanese bases, especially Rabaul, under sustained air attack and isolation rather than direct assault. Within that logic, the Huon Peninsula mattered because it bordered the Vitiaz and Dampier Straits, sea lanes that linked the Solomon Sea to the Bismarck Sea and helped define access to New Britain. Finschhafen itself sat on the northeastern tip of the Huon Peninsula, with a small airfield and a sheltered anchorage that could be developed into an air and naval base. For Allied planners, it complemented Lae. Lae offered a major port and an entry to the Markham Valley, while Finschhafen offered a forward position to control the straits and support the next step toward New Britain. Japanese forces had occupied Finschhafen in March 1942, integrating it into a coastal defense and supply network intended to protect Lae and sustain operations along the Huon Peninsula. The immediate precondition for the Finschhafen operation was the rapid September 1943 Allied success at Lae. After Lae fell sooner than expected, MacArthur pressed for an exploitation move along the coast, and on September 17th, he ordered Finschhafen seized. The ground task fell primarily to the Australian 9th Division under Major General George Wooten, a formation recently reorganized for jungle warfare after earlier service in North Africa. Operating within an Allied framework that combined Australian infantry and artillery with American amphibious lift and littoral support units. Both sides recognized that the battle would be shaped as much by movement and supply as by the capture of the town itself. Allied planning assumed that sea control, air cover, and the ability to land and sustain troops along narrow beaches could convert coastal lodgements into forward bases. Japanese planning, constrained by Allied air power and interdiction at sea, depended on moving formations down the coast and across difficult interior tracks to concentrate enough strength for local defense and counterattack. The opening Allied assault force was therefore organized as a limited initial landing group of about 5,300 men, while Japanese strength in the first phase was assessed at roughly 4,000 to 5,000 in the area, with the prospect of rapid reinforcement from larger formations tied to the 20th Division and associated units. On 21 September 1943, the decision to strike Finschhafen was converted into a tightly timed amphibious move. Rear Admiral Daniel E. Barbès, 7th Amphibious Force, assembled at Lae with 8 LSTs, 16 LCIs, 10 destroyers, and 4 APDs, then prepared to carry the Australian 9th Division's assault element east along the Huon Peninsula. Major General George Wooten selected Brigadier Victor Windyer's 20th Infantry Brigade Group as the landing force, while ordering the 22nd Infantry Battalion to advance overland from Lae to threaten Langemak Bay and complicate Japanese coastal movement south of the objective. The convoy sailed from Lae on the afternoon of September 21st for a run of roughly 82 miles. Alongside Australian infantry, artillery support elements, and headquarters detachments, the lift included attached amphibious engineers, a boat company and part of the shore battalion of the 532nd Engineer Boat and Shore Regiment, with 575 men, 10 LCMs, and 15 LCVPs assigned to beach operations and immediate sustainment. These details reflected a practical assumption shared by Allied planners in New Guinea by late 1943. Success depended not only on landing troops, but on getting vehicles, ammunition, medical evacuation, and food moving across a narrow strip of sand under uncertain air and ground threat. The landing site, designated Scarlet, lay about 6 miles north of Finschhafen, at the mouth of the Song River. It was a constrained shoreline, around 900 yards long and about 30 feet wide, bounded by coral features that limited approaches and made navigation errors costly. In darkness at 0445 on 22nd September, the first assault wave went in under destroyer bombardment. Finding the correct beach in the dark proved difficult. Many craft carrying the first waves lost direction and came ashore in a small cove south of Scarlet, while later waves, guided by first light, landed closer to the intended points. Japanese resistance at the waterline varied by sector and timing. The early waves that drifted into the cove met scattered, less coordinated fire from posts in the jungle fringe. Forces landing nearer the intended beach faced better prepared positions, including log and earth pillboxes. By about 9:30, the immediate beach defenses had been reduced. Most men and initial stores were ashore, and the landing craft began retracting. Fighting then shifted inland as Japanese survivors pulled back to nearby rising ground, and Australian units consolidated a defensible perimeter. By the end of the morning, the 2nd 17 Battalion had secured the beachhead area, while the 2nd 13th Battalion began moving south toward Heldsbach, the settlement just north of the Finschhafen airstrip, setting conditions for a continued advance the following day. From the Japanese perspective, the landings did not initially strike the center of their local disposition. General Eizo Yamada had placed only a small portion of his force opposite Scarlet Beach, keeping most of his roughly 4,000-man command farther south around Hanisch Harbor and in the Saddleberg high ground, which overlooked the coastal corridor and the approaches to both Finschhafen and Langemak Bay. Once the Allied landing was confirmed, Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi ordered Yamada to concentrate at Saddleberg and attack promptly, aiming to hold or damage the beachhead before larger reinforcements could arrive. Adachi also pressed Lieutenant General Shigeru Katagiris, 20th Division, moving toward the area by a combination of overland marching and barge lift of heavy material to accelerate its approach. Air and sea activity reinforced how quickly local actions around a beach could escalate into a contest between wider operational systems. In the days before 22nd September, Allied aircraft struck targets intended to reduce Japanese air interference and disrupt communications feeding Finschhafen, while PT boats worked the coastal night routes. Japanese naval air from Rabaul attacked the amphibious force on 22nd and again on 24th September. Early warning from a radar picket destroyer and Allied fighter cover, combined with ship maneuver and anti-aircraft fire, prevented the attackers from achieving decisive results against the retiring transports and escorts. Onshore, the engineers began shaping the beachhead into a functional node. Roads and dumps were laid out, unloading continued, and small craft started the short-haul supply runs that would become essential once the advance moved beyond the immediate shoreline. The capture of Finschhafen was planned as an enabling operation rather than an end state. For MacArthur's headquarters, the objective was to secure a site that could be expanded into a major air and naval base on the Huon Peninsula, supporting subsequent operations across the Vitiaz Strait toward New Britain, and tightening Allied control of the sea passages that connected New Guinea to the Bismarck Archipelago. In the larger cartwheel sequence, Finschhafen was treated as a step toward controlling the straits and sustaining the onward amphibious campaign into 1944. Allied planning combined Australian ground maneuver with American amphibious lift and air cover. The ground task was assigned to the Australian 9th Division, but only one brigade, the 20th Infantry Brigade, was initially allocated for the seizure of the town and its airfield, reflecting both tempo and shipping constraints. Senior Australian commanders, including Blamey and Wooten, and the brigade commander Windyer, expressed reservations about whether a single brigade constituted sufficient strength if Japanese forces proved larger than expected. However, the operational logic favored speed, surprise, and rapid establishment of a lodgment that could then be reinforced. Intelligence shaped these choices in ways that later proved consequential. Allied reports suggested a much smaller Japanese garrison than was actually present, encouraging a plan that emphasized a quick landing north of the objective, followed by a fast, coastal advance. In practice, both faulty mapping and incomplete appreciation of Japanese dispositions meant that planners accepted higher uncertainty in exchange for maintaining momentum after Leh. The plan, therefore, relied on the expectation that any strong resistance would be localized, and that the brigade could outpace Japanese concentration before a coordinated counterattack developed. Logistics was treated as the limiting factor. The landing in advance required continuous beach supply because there was no usable port infrastructure at the start. Roads were minimal, and the coastal track and river crossings constrained movement of artillery, engineers, and medical evacuation. Australian infantry battalions carried limited motor transport in the early phase, while engineers and artillery depended on a small number of vehicles and the ability to keep the beachhead functioning as a transshipment point. This made the initial perimeter and the security of unloading sites a core element of the plan, not a secondary concern. Japanese planning approached the same geography from the opposite direction. For Adachi's 18th Army, holding the Huon Peninsula sector helped protect the remnants of the Lei defense system and preserve freedom of action along the northeast coast. The key was not only the coastal town, but the inland high ground around Saddleberg, which overlooked approaches to Finschhafen and could be used to disrupt Allied movement and threaten the beachhead. When the Allied landing occurred, Japanese intent focused on concentrating forces and striking the lodgment before Allied reinforcement and base construction could convert the position into a permanent operational hub. Both sides therefore entered the operation with plans that depended on time. The Allies aimed to seize Finschhafen quickly, secure the airfield and anchorage, and then absorb Japanese reaction with reinforcements and fire support. The Japanese aimed to delay the coastal advance, preserve combat power in terrain that reduced Allied firepower advantage, and then conduct a counterattack timed to exploit the vulnerability of an amphibious force sustained across a single beach. The opening phase would test which assumption was more realistic, that speed could substitute for mass, or that concentration in terrain could neutralize a fast landing. The first engagements after the Scarlet Beach landing were defined by two immediate requirements: securing enough terrain to keep the beach functioning as a supply point, and opening a route south to the objective before Japanese forces could concentrate on the inland high ground. On 22 September 1943, after the assault waves cleared the beach defenses, Australian units of the 20th Infantry Brigade pushed inland to widen the perimeter and take key features controlling the approaches from Katika and the track system leading toward the coast road. Japanese detachments that had fallen back from the shoreline reorganized around prepared positions near Katika, using jungle cover, log and earthworks, and interlocking small arms fire to slow movement off the beach. That same day, fighting developed around Katika as the Japanese attempted to delay the breakout from the landing area. Elements of all three battalions of the 20th Brigade, the 213th, 215th, and 217th, were drawn into these actions as they worked to secure the track junctions and prevent Japanese forces from maintaining observation and fire over the beach and unloading lanes. The pattern that emerged was consistent across the first week: short-range contacts, rapid dispersal into cover, and repeated attempts to outflank rather than hold ground in continuous lines. By 23 September, the Australian advance south encountered the first major natural obstacle on the coastal axis, the Bumi River, with Japanese troops positioned to contest crossings and delay any approach toward Helsbach and Finschhafen. Reconnaissance under fire became a recurring tactical problem. At the river on the 23rd of September, Corporal Reese Tart of the 2/15th Battalion was killed while examining a possible crossing point, an incident that illustrated how the advance depended on small groups locating usable fords and boat points under observation. The 20th Brigade continued pressing for a crossing by hard marching and patrol work, while its rear and supply line remained tied to a single beach, whose capacity depended on continuous unloading and short-haul movement inland. Once a crossing was secured, the 2nd 15 Battalion forced Japanese naval troops off a hill position that dominated the approach routes south of the river. This action created space for the 2nd and 13th Battalion to develop an approach toward Finschhafen from the west, rather than moving only along the exposed coastal track. At the same time, the 2nd 17 Battalion was increasingly allocated to flank protection and security tasks along the line of communication back to Scarlet Beach, especially around the Javanang area and the tracks that connected towards Saddleberg. This division of labor shaped the first phase of the campaign: one battalion driving forward, one widening the axis and preparing the approach, and one holding the supply corridor open against infiltration and attack. As September progressed, the fighting shifted from the immediate beachhead and river lines to a Japanese defensive zone anchored on features near Kakakog, which covered the approaches into Finschhafen. The Australians addressed these positions with combined arms suited to jungle constraints. Artillery fire from field guns firing onto identified strongpoints, machine gun support to suppress movement across open patches and track mouths, and airstrikes where targets could be fixed by patrols. Royal Australian Air Force dive bombers, including Vultee Vengeances, were used against forward defenses when weather and visibility allowed, timed to support infantry assaults. Meanwhile, a second Allied movement unfolded independently along the coast from the south. The Australian 22nd Infantry Battalion advanced northward from the Loy area, aiming to pressure the Finschhafen perimeter from the opposite direction and reduce the likelihood that Japanese forces could disengage cleanly to interior positions. On October 1st, this southern force crossed the Mape River near Langamak Bay, closing distance toward the town as the 20th Brigade attacked the main defenses closer to Kakakog. On October 1st, Australian troops overwhelmed the Kakakog defensive positions after preparatory fire support, with Japanese losses assessed in the range of roughly 80 to 100 killed in that engagement. The result was a practical turning point in the opening phase. The Japanese began withdrawing from the immediate Finschhafen area toward inland positions, prioritizing preservation of forces that could threaten the Allied supply line rather than holding the coastal town at fixed cost. On October 2, 1943, Australian troops entered Finschhafen and secured the port area and airfield zone with limited resistance, while the converging pressure from north and south reduced the space available for a coherent Japanese coastal defense. The fighting, however, had already revealed the next problem that would dominate the campaign. The inland high ground remained occupied, and the beachhead supply corridor could be targeted by forces operating from Saddleberg and the track network behind the newly captured town. After the fall of Finschhafen on October 2, 1943, the character of the campaign shifted from an advance on a coastal objective to a struggle over the Allied line of communications. The town and airfield area could be held with relatively light forces, but the entire position depended on a narrow supply corridor back to Scarlet Beach, where unloading sites, dumps, and tracks were exposed to attack from the inland high ground around Saddleberg. Japanese intent, shaped by Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi's direction to regain the initiative, focused on concentrating combat units inland and striking the beachhead before Allied construction and reinforcement could turn the lodgment into a permanent base. A crisis of assessment developed alongside the tactical problem. Allied headquarters had underestimated Japanese strength in the area. At one point, GHQ intelligence judged the local Japanese presence to be about 350, while the actual Japanese forces already positioned around Saddleberg and Finschhafen were assessed at about 5,000, with reinforcements moving in. This influenced the timing of reinforcements, forcing Australian commanders to cover a widening front with limited infantry while maintaining beach security, river crossings, and the new perimeter around Finschhafen. Japanese reinforcement and preparation accelerated through early October. Units of the 20th Division, particularly the 79th and 89th Infantry Regiments, drew together inland, while supporting elements such as the 26th Field Artillery Regiment and naval ground troops added depth to the defensive and counterattack plan. By mid-October, Japanese strength in the wider sector was estimated at roughly 12,000 for the counteroffensive phase, compared to about 5,300 men in the initial Allied landing force and its early follow-on elements. On the ground, the escalation was visible in a series of increasingly organized probes aimed at the coastal road and the approaches to the beachhead. Around Jivavaneng, blocking positions were attacked repeatedly as Japanese forces sought to open a route to the coast. Australian units reoriented from pursuit toward Finschhafen to defense in depth. Some battalions remained around the town, but key formations shifted back toward Scarlet Beach and Heldsbach to protect the supply lifeline. Local fighting became attritional, with small defended features changing hands or being subjected to repeated assaults designed to test the perimeter and identify weak points. The first clear indication that the Japanese would add a maritime component came before the main counterattack. On the night of 8th to 9th October, a seaborne move associated with the Sugino craft raiding unit, suffered a major setback when PT-128 and PT-194 destroyed more than half of 7 landing craft en route, reducing the weight and coordination of the planned beach assault. Even so, the continued attempt to combine inland pressure with a coastal strike demonstrated a Japanese effort to overwhelm the lodgment by attacking its logistical heart rather than contesting the captured town directly. By October 10th, Australian defensive preparations around Scarlet Beach were being tightened around specific fire plans and weapon placements rather than broad maneuver. The beach defenses included a Bofors 40mm gun of the 10th Light Anti-Aircraft Battery, anti-tank guns, and machine guns, augmented by U.S. Army heavy weapons manned by troops of the 532nd Engineer, Boat and Shore Regiment at the beach installations. This blend of Australian infantry, specialist gunners, and American shore units reflected the operational reality that the beachhead itself had become a frontline position. The main Japanese counterattack began on October 16th, signaled by a large bonfire on Saddleberg. It was planned as a 3-pronged action: a diversionary push from the north, a company-level attempt to hit Scarlet Beach from the sea, and a central drive from Saddleberg by the main bodies of the 79th and 80th Infantry Regiments along 2 lines, one toward Scarlet Beach and one toward Heldsbach along the Saddleberg Road. The intent was to break through to the coast, link the regiments, and then clear the Finschhafen and Langemak Bay areas. The opening moves did not immediately achieve the intended concentration, but they created the conditions for the most sustained defensive fighting of the campaign in the days that followed. The counteroffensive reached its most intense phase between 16th and 21st October 1943, when the focus narrowed to a single operational question: whether the Japanese could rupture the Scarlet Beach lodgment and sever the supply system that sustained Finschhafen. By this point, Japanese strength on the Saddleberg-Finschhafen front had grown to about 12,000, and Australian misunderstandings about local enemy numbers had largely evaporated. Major General George Wooten reorganized the defense by assigning the 24th Infantry Brigade to hold the northern sector of the beachhead and the 20th Infantry Brigade the southern sector, concentrating artillery and machine gun coverage over the coastal approaches and the key track junctions. The fighting opened with pressure on the inland screen. Around Jivavaneng, Japanese attacks tested the blocking positions and attempted to widen gaps between units holding the track network. On 16th October, the Australians drove attackers off in that sector, but this did not end the immediate threat. It marked the start of a period in which the defense depended on holding small pieces of high ground and keeping lateral movement possible between battalions. On 17th October, a heavy Japanese air raid in the Scarlet Bay area preceded the expected seaborne component. That night, 3 barge loads of Japanese troops attempted to reach the beachhead under rain and darkness. The landing force was met by concentrated fire from the beach defenses, including American gunners and Australian infantry and anti-aircraft crews. The barges were destroyed in the approaches, and the attempt failed to establish a coherent foothold on the shoreline. The main danger did not come from the surf line, but from the ground immediately behind it. Later on, 17th October, Japanese troops who had slipped through the Australian screen seized high ground about 2,700 meters west of Scarlet Beach, creating a direct threat to artillery positions, supply dumps, and the narrow routes that linked the beach to the forward units. Over 17 and 18 in October, Australian battalions, including the 228th and 243rd, fought repeated attacks intended to expand that penetration and split the beachhead into isolated pockets. During the crisis on October 18th, the fighting closed to ranges at which weapons normally reserved for air defense and indirect fire were used as direct fire systems. Japanese troops pushed towards Siki Cove and the nearby Australian guns. Bofors 40mm weapons of the 2/4th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment and 25-pounders of the 212th Field Regiment fired over open sights at attackers approaching to within about 750 meters, and the Bofors crews engaged targets as close as roughly 200 meters. The 212 Field Regiment fired more than 200 rounds in this direct fire role during the engagement, holding the gun line at a moment when a breakthrough to the beach would have forced abandonment of stores and evacuation of the lodgment. Despite these defenses, parts of the perimeter were temporarily cut. Japanese movement into Siki Cove divided the sectors held by the 24th and 20th Brigades, and isolated companies depended on air resupply. Wirraway aircraft of No. 4 Squadron RAAF dropped ammunition, food, and messages to sustain positions that could not be reached reliably by ground routes under attack. Command decisions became part of the tactical struggle. In the confusion, a withdrawal from key ground around Kataka granted the Japanese a strong point dominating approaches. Wooten reacted sharply, and the position was retaken in a counterattack supported by artillery. From 19th October onward, the Australians began to regain initiative locally. The 28th recaptured Katika, then held it through multiple attempts to retake it, including direct fire use of Japanese artillery at close range. The Japanese thrust began to lose cohesion as its penetration failed to link into a decisive break. On October 21st, Japanese forces withdrew from Siki Cove, although fighting around Katika continued until October 24th, as further attacks were checked by fixed defenses, artillery concentration, and the inability of Japanese units to coordinate assaults at the required weight. By the end of the counteroffensive phase, Japanese losses were assessed at about 1,500 casualties, including at least 679 killed, while Australian losses in this phase were about 228 casualties, including 49 dead. Another widely cited breakdown for the same period lists 679 Japanese killed and 821 wounded, and 49 Australians killed and 179 wounded. With the immediate threat to Scarlet Beach reduced after 21st to 24th October, both sides shifted from large assaults to a contest of adaptation, how to keep forces supplied and positioned in terrain where movement was slow and contact was often decided by patrols rather than set-piece battles. For the Australians, the central task became converting a vulnerable lodgment into a functioning base system. For the Japanese, the task became preserving combat power and freedom of movement in the inland high ground, while continuing to threaten the coastal supply corridor when opportunities appeared. Australian adaptation began with force reallocation and perimeter engineering. Units that had been driving south in late September were rotated into defense and security roles. Battalions were assigned fixed sectors, wire and firing lanes were cut around key track mouths, and artillery observers were positioned to call fire on likely approaches. The mixed composition of the beachhead defense also hardened. Australian infantry and gunners remained the core, while American shore and boat units continued to operate unloading points and defend installations with heavy weapons. This reduced the gap between combat troops and sustainment troops, because the beach area itself was treated as forward ground rather than rear area. The second adjustment was logistics under fire. The supply chain was simplified into short, repeatable movements, beach dumps to forward dumps, then to company supply points, with strict control of road priority for ammunition, water, and medical evacuation. When tracks were interdicted, small airdrops were still used for isolated posts, but the emphasis shifted to keeping ground routes open by continuous patrolling and rapid repair of washed-out sections and bridges. Engineers worked to improve the Finschhafen area so that air operations could expand, increasing the availability of close air support, reconnaissance flights, and casualty evacuation. These changes did not remove the constraints of jungle terrain, but they reduced the likelihood that a single penetration could halt the entire supply system. Tactically, Australian units adapted by treating Japanese infiltration as the default threat. Night listening posts, overlapping patrol schedules, and immediate counter-penetration drills were used to prevent small groups from establishing positions that could observe or fire on the beach routes. Fire planning also evolved. Rather than waiting for set engagements, battalion commanders coordinated pre-registered artillery tasks on track junctions, ridge lines, and creek crossings that Japanese troops were likely to use. Infantry movement increasingly relied on bounding patrols and deliberate clearing of small features, because rapid advances along single tracks had repeatedly created exposed flanks. Japanese adaptation followed a different logic, shaped by supply limits and Allied air superiority. After the October counteroffensive failed to reach the coast, Japanese forces continued to use the same advantages that had brought them close to the beachhead: interior routes, night movement, and the ability to concentrate locally for short bursts of action. At the same time, the cost of sustained assaults increased. Food and ammunition had to be carried by hand over steep ground and along narrow tracks, while barge and small craft movement on the coast faced interdiction. Units, therefore, shifted toward holding high ground and using small-scale attacks, sniping and ambushes to impose delay and attrition while preparing fallback positions that could not easily be bypassed. The inland high ground, especially around Saddleberg, became the center of this contest. From the Japanese perspective, it was a place where relatively limited forces could threaten the coastal corridor and compel the Australians to keep substantial strength tied to defense. From the Australian perspective, it represented an unresolved operational problem. As long as Japanese troops held commanding ridges and track nodes inland, the base at Finschhafen could be supplied only under continuous risk. The campaign therefore entered a phase in which both sides prepared for a renewed struggle over the heights, while daily fighting continued through patrol clashes, ambushes on tracks, and artillery and airstrikes directed at identified strongpoints and supply routes. By late October 1943, the campaign reached a structural impasse. Finschhafen and its airfield area were in Allied hands, but Japanese forces still held the inland heights around Saddleberg, a mission station on a ridge about 900 meters above sea level and roughly 8 kilometers inland. From that elevation, Japanese observers and patrols could threaten the coastal corridor linking Finschhafen, Heldsbach, and Scarlet Beach. For the Australians, this meant that holding the port did not by itself secure the base. For the Japanese, it meant the inland position remained a lever to disrupt Allied supply and to cover their own movement westward. The turning point emerged when Allied command treated Saddleberg as the decisive ground, rather than a secondary objective. Major General George Wooten assigned the main effort to Brigadier David Whitehead's 26th Infantry Brigade of the Australian 9th Division, supported by Matilda tanks from C Squadron of the 1st Tank Battalion and artillery, including the 2nd Ulster 12th Field Regiment and a mountain battery suited to steep, broken terrain. The operational intention was direct: remove Japanese control of the high ground so that the beachhead and Finschhafen base could function without constant threat from above. Japanese forces, primarily elements of the 20th Division, with troops from the 79th and 89th Infantry Regiments and supporting arms, treated Saddleberg as a prepared defensive position and a staging area. Their intention was to force the Australians to fight uphill through narrow approaches where tanks were restricted by jungle tracks, where artillery observation was difficult, and where small defensive positions could delay progress. Holding the ridge also protected interior routes toward Wario and Sao, which were becoming increasingly important as coastal movement by barge faced interdiction. The assault began on November 17, 1943. Progress depended on controlling a sequence of intermediate features and track junctions rather than advancing on a broad front. Infantry attacks were coordinated with artillery concentrations and tank infantry movement where the ground allowed, but the terrain imposed a pattern of short bounds. One ridgeline secured, one ravine crossed, then another defended, null reduced. Japanese defenders relied on mutually supporting positions, frequently forcing the attackers to reorganize and clear one strong point at a time. The battle, therefore, became an engineering and fire control problem, as much as a maneuver problem, cutting tracks, hauling ammunition forward by hand, and maintaining communications in thick vegetation. Several actions marked the shift in momentum. As Australian units worked forward, they seized key intermediate hills that limited Japanese observation and shortened the final approach. Tanks, when they could be brought up, were used to suppress or destroy bunkers and to support infantry assaults. But they also became terrain-bound assets that required protection against close-range attack and mechanical failure in muddy conditions. For Japanese defenders, the pressure forced choices between holding each position to the last and preserving forces for the next line. Withdrawals, when they occurred, were typically short and toward another prepared feature, rather than a retreat from the ridge complex as a whole. By 24th November, Australian troops were close enough to the summit position that the fighting turned into repeated close-range clearances of trenches and weapon pits. On the 25th of November, 1943, the summit area around the mission station was captured by Australian forces, signaling the end of the organized Japanese hold on Saddleberg. Australian casualties for the battle were reported as 49 killed and 118 wounded. Japanese losses were described as heavy, and surviving units withdrew away from the coast toward inland routes leading to Warao and farther north. The immediate consequence was operational rather than symbolic. With Saddleberg lost, Japanese forces no longer held the dominant observation point over the coastal corridor and could not credibly threaten Scarlet Beach and the Finschhafen base in the same way. For the Australians and their American amphibious partners, this reduced the risk that a renewed counterattack could sever unloading and supply, enabling the base to expand and support the next advances along the Huon Peninsula. For the Japanese, the loss forced a transition from attempts to regain the coast to a fighting withdrawal through successive inland positions, where the remaining objective became delaying pursuit while conserving enough strength to continue organized resistance farther north. The capture of Saddleberg on the 25th of November, 1943, changed the immediate balance of the Huon Peninsula campaign, but it did not end combat operations in the sector. For the Australians, the next requirement was to push the Japanese out of the remaining ridge and track system that still covered the withdrawal routes north and threatened movement along the coast. For the Japanese, the loss of the dominant height removed the best platform for renewed attacks on the Finschhafen base area, and forced a transition toward delaying actions designed to preserve organized units as they fell back towards Sao. In the days after 25th November, Japanese forces withdrew from the Saddleberg area toward a new defensive line around Warao, using steep ground, secondary tracks, and night movement to avoid decisive engagement in open terrain. This withdrawal was not a single movement, but a sequence of short retrograde steps. Small rear guards held ridge features and track junctions long enough to let the main bodies pull back, then disengage to the next prepared position. Australian patrols and advance guards followed cautiously, because previous experience around Scarlet Beach had shown how quickly Japanese infiltration could threaten rear areas if the pursuit outpaced its own logistics and flank security. Australian operations shifted to a methodical advance north and northwest from the Finschhafen-Helsbach area. The 9th Division reorganized for sustained operations away from the initial beachhead. Supply routes were extended forward, engineer work focused on tracks and bridges, and artillery and tank support were moved as far inland as the ground permitted. The same constraints that had shaped the assault on Saddleberg continued to shape the pursuit. Tanks and heavy weapons could influence specific fights where tracks allowed them forward, but much of the movement and combat still depended on infantry clearing successive features at close range. The fighting that followed developed into a series of engagements around Warao and adjacent ridges in early to mid-December 1943. Japanese troops used the terrain to slow the advance, forcing Australian units to clear one defended feature at a time rather than bypassing resistance. The objective on the Australian side was not only to take villages and map points, but to break the coherence of the defensive line so that Japanese forces could not re-establish another controlling position like Saddleberg. On the Japanese side, the objective was to delay without being fixed and destroyed, preserving enough strength to continue a controlled withdrawal toward the northern Huon coastline. While ground combat continued inland, the Allied base at Finschhafen began expanding into the role originally intended for it. The port area and nearby anchorages supported coastal supply movement. The airstrip was improved to increase sortie generation and reconnaissance coverage, and the site began to function as a forward staging point for further operations across the Vichaz Strait and along the New Guinea coast. This development mattered tactically as well as operationally. Stronger air cover and shorter supply lines reduced the possibility of a renewed Japanese counterattack against the original lodgment, and increased Allied ability to interdict barge traffic and coastal movement. For the local civilian population, the transition from a coastal battle to a pursuit phase did not mean a return to normal conditions. Villages on the movement corridors faced repeated displacement as units moved through. Gardens and food stores were exposed to requisition or destruction, and travel became dangerous due to patrol contacts, mines, and stray fire. Civilian labor, already a feature of the Japanese occupation system in parts of New Guinea, and later Allied requirements for carriers and guides, meant that local communities experienced the campaign partly through demands placed on manpower and resources rather than through direct participation in combat. By late December, Japanese units continued withdrawing northward towards Sao, increasingly constrained by shortages and by the growing Allied ability to strike movement routes from the air and sea. The final stage of the withdrawal was shaped by a strategic development beyond the Huon Peninsula itself. On January 2, 1944, American forces landed at Sidor to the west, creating a threat to Japanese lateral movement and increasing pressure on the retreat corridor. Under these conditions, Japanese forces accelerated their pullback, abandoning positions before they could be enveloped, while Australian units continued advancing along the coast and inland tracks to close the remaining distance to Sao. By mid-January 1944, Australian troops occupied Sao, marking the end of the immediate Huon Peninsula campaign that had begun with the landing at Scarlet Beach in September. The outcome was not defined by a single surrender event, but by the cumulative effect of losing key ground, failing to break the beachhead in October, and then being compelled to withdraw after Saddleberg and Warao. The Japanese retained organized forces, but gave up the ability to contest the straits from the Huon Peninsula. The Allies secured a base complex that supported the next phase of operations toward New Britain and further along the northern coast of New Guinea. In the wider Pacific War, the fighting at Finschhafen mattered less as an isolated town seizure than as a test of whether the Allies could turn a coastal landing into a durable operating base under sustained counterattack. The sequence from the 22nd September 1943 landing at Scarlet Beach, through the Japanese counteroffensive in mid-late October, and the inland battle for Saddleberg in November showed how control of a port and airfield was inseparable from control of the inland heights that dominated supply routes. When Saddleberg fell on the 25th of November 1943, the outcome was not only tactical ground gained, but a reduction in Japan's ability to threaten the coastal corridor that kept Finschhafen functioning. For Allied strategy, Finschhafen supported the operational geometry of Operation Cartwheel, tightening control over the Vitiaz and Dampier Straits, extending air coverage northward, and creating a forward node for moves toward New Britain and along the New Guinea coast. The base development that followed shifted the balance between marching supply overland and moving it by sea and air, shortening the distance between landing points, airfields, and frontline units. In practical terms, it increased the tempo at which subsequent operations could be staged, while allowing larger Japanese bases to be bypassed and isolated, rather than attacked frontally. For the Australian Army, the campaign became a reference point for adapting formations designed for earlier theaters to a jungle and amphibious environment. The 9th Division, which had previously fought in North Africa, operated in New Guinea with different constraints: steep terrain, narrow tracks, malaria risk, and logistics tied to beach unloading rather than established ports. The battle also highlighted the importance of coordination with American amphibious and engineering units, since the beachhead was simultaneously a front line, a supply depot, and a casualty evacuation hub. For the Japanese 18th Army, the campaign illustrated the limits of counterattack doctrine when sea and air movement were increasingly restricted. The October attempt to rupture the beachhead combined inland thrusts from Saddleberg with a limited seaborne component. It showed how difficult it had become to mass forces quickly near the coast under Allied interdiction. After Saddleberg, the remaining option was a fighting withdrawal through successive inland positions toward Warao and then north toward Sao, trading terrain for time and preserving organized units despite reduced supply and freedom of movement. The campaign also offers a case study in how numbers and casualty accounting are treated in operational history. Reported figures for the October counteroffensive phase commonly cite Japanese losses in the range of roughly 1,500 casualties, with at least 679 killed, and Australian losses around 228 casualties, including 49 dead. While the Saddleberg fighting is often summarized with Australian losses reported as 49 killed and 118 wounded, Beyond these snapshots, historical debate tends to focus less on exact totals than on what the losses indicate about the changing balance of mobility, supply, and fire support in late 1943. For civilians on the Huon Peninsula, the legacy was shaped by displacement, disruption of gardens and local trade, and the dangers created by prolonged movement of armed forces through villages and tracks. Many communities experienced the campaign through forced relocation, the presence of patrol clashes near settlements, and demands placed on labor and carriers by military needs. Post-war recovery therefore included not only physical repair, but the restoration of local agriculture and movement networks affected by months of fighting. In memory and commemoration, Finschhafen tends to sit between larger names in Pacific historiography. It is often remembered in Australia within the narrative of the 9th Division's New Guinea operations and the Huon Peninsula advance, while in Japanese remembrance it forms part of the longer experience of the 18th Army's attritional retreat under growing Allied air-sea dominance. In Papua New Guinea, the campaign is embedded in local landscapes through wartime sites, graves, and oral histories that frame the conflict as an intense external event imposed on existing communities. Historically, the battle's significance lies in its demonstration that amphibious success in the Southwest Pacific required more than landing skill. It required sustaining a narrow logistical system, defending it against infiltration and counterattack, and then removing inland observation and maneuver advantages that could not be neutralized by holding the coastline alone. Finschhafen showed how a coastal foothold could be converted into an operational platform only when the surrounding terrain system was brought under control, linking sea lift, air cover, engineering, and infantry operations into a single continuous campaign.